Okay. Streaming is working, that's good. Wonderful. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Quarantine-ish Book Talks hosted by the Jewish Women's Archive and jewishLIVE. I'm Judith Rosenbaum. I'm the CEO of JWA, and I am really glad to be with all of you here tonight. Here on the East Coast, we are in the final moments of the holiday of Tisha B'Av. So if you have been commemorating, I hope it's been a meaningful day for you. And I think that our conversation tonight will provide a fitting end. As usual, I hope people will introduce yourselves in the chat box and ask your questions in the chat box too, and I will share them in the second half of our program. And right now I am so delighted to introduce Jennifer Rosner, who in addition to writing the wonderful novel we're going to discuss tonight, The Yellow Bird Sings, is also the author of a memoir, If a Tree Falls, A Family's Quest to Hear and Be Heard. And her children's book, The Mitten String, is a Sidney Taylor Book Award notable. Jennifer's writing has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Massachusetts Review, The Forward, and Good Housekeeping. She lives in Western Massachusetts with her family. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
We are delighted to have you with us tonight. So why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about how you came to write this book, which is your debut novel?
Yeah. So I'll just give you a little bit of background, which is that I was studying philosophy. I got a PhD in philosophy at Stanford. And while just before going on the academic job market, I had our first daughter, and she was born deaf. And that was a kind of a shock at the time, because we didn't expect it. There wasn't any reason in our family to know that there were deaf ancestors, but in the end, after some research, we discovered that there were, and that it was a recessive gene. But at the time, I just needed to start writing sort of personal things like journaling about the experience, and that kind of process of creative writing. I loved it very much. It was in contrast to academic writing, which wasn't as pleasant. And I ended up writing the memoir you mentioned, If a Tree Falls. And when I was at a book event for that memoir, I was discussing how we made a choice to give our children access to sound with hearing technology, and we were working with them to vocalize. And I was talking about how happy we were if they made really any sound at all. We were celebrating every utterance. And a woman at the book talk mentioned to me her childhood experience of hiding in a shoemaker's attic with her mother, having to be completely silent during World War II. And just imagining this girl needing to be silent, especially in light of all the work we were doing with our children to make sound, it really struck me and stuck with me. And I thought also about her mother needing to keep her silent and what that must have been like. And that was kind of the seed for the novel. I thought a lot about hiddenness and silence and what that would mean, and just led me into this project.
It's always really interesting to hear what how people find the path to the story that emerges. So beginning with that piece about a hidden child, and my children are particularly loud tonight, so I have much empathy for someone who's trying to keep children quiet, because I would have failed at that miserably. So once you had that piece of the story, that kind of kernel to start with, how did you go about researching it? Because there's so much detail, and it's such you paint such a vivid scene of all the different parts, the barn and the woods and the convent, and so many different settings. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how you were able to build the story around that initial kernel.
Well, so I ended up getting in touch with that woman, and I interviewed her, and through her I met several other hidden children and started interviewing many hidden children and hearing all kinds of different stories. That woman had been in this little shoemaker's attic, having to be silent and still. I also met a woman who was hiding in plain sight, wearing a cross on sort of the Aryan side at a neighbor's farm, and someone was carried, over a ghetto wall in a suitcase, and this boy was hiding in a school attic where he could see through the slats other children playing in the schoolyard, but he had to be silent. I mean, all these different stories. And I listened and interviewed and really steeped myself in it. And then I set all those stories aside because I wasn't going to write any of those people's story. I thought maybe they'll write their stories, maybe their family will want to write the stories, but they were just kind of, I don't know, I absorbed them. And I sat down to write my own completely different story. And a lot of, choices came in, maybe familial, relational to my own experience, like that she became a musical prodigy, and that she had this invisible friend of sorts, etc. But after drafting this, my own story, I ended up contacting a guide in Poland, and my eldest daughter and I went to Poland, and this guide was really amazing. He read my manuscript draft before we came, and he brought me to settings. So he brought me to this area of farmland in Poland. And it was really important for me to see, because you got to see that while they had a lot of land, they were very close to their nearest neighbor. So there'd be this farmhouse and then a barn behind, and then this long swath of farmland, but they were pretty close. And the next door neighbor could see what was happening in their, the farmhouse and the barn, the field. And I needed to understand the proximity and kind of the issue of nosiness and all kinds of things. And he brought me to a convent where Jewish children had been hidden, and I got to walk in and smell that there was mushroom soup on the stove, and like how my feet hit the stone in the place. And she showed me the partition where the children were put, and all kinds of kind of sensory details about the convent. And then he also took me to this swath of like primeval forest where partisans had camped. We went there in December because I wanted to know my character was going to be in the winter, in the fields and in the forest in winter, and I needed to know what that would be like. And it was very brutal. I mean, my daughter was like, "Really, Mom? That's what we're doing, and can't your next book be set in Greece or Italy or something?" But we were in this, frigid forest, and it was very dense. And then in addition to kind of that travel, I went to Tel Aviv, and I got to meet Amnon Weinstein, who's this incredible violin maker who's been rescuing violins from the Holocaust and being played around the world in these orchestras. But I ended up also working with consultants. Like I talked to a Holocaust historian and to nuns, and I worked with a tracker who helped me understand how someone could move through the woods without leaving a trace, and a mushroom forager. But the person I worked most closely with was a master class violinist who kind of really helped me understand how to develop the prodigy character, how she would practice, what she would play, the order of the pieces, what would make sense as musical pieces, and that kind of thing. So it does take a village to write a novel. I think most novelists find that they really kind of depend on others in terms of experts in areas where, it's impossible to become an expert very quickly. So, but it was really interesting, and just so many generous people kind of giving advice. And one of the things that was really interesting about our guide in Poland is that at nighttime, he would sit and translate texts that hadn't been translated into English yet. So he would translate the sections he thought that might be relevant for me. But he also talked to me about like the names I was choosing. And he helped me understand that even like the name might be a suitable name for a Jewish Polish woman, but there would be an economic connotation that I might not want, and very subtle things that I really couldn't know from Western Massachusetts when I Googled, behind the name and learned about names. So all kinds of things were coming from the travel and from consulting with people.
That's amazing. It sounds like you had like the best helpers and consultants advising the project. You were very lucky.
I really was very generous, very smart, really helping me get steeped in the details I needed to understand.
Is there like a cottage industry of people who help writers kind of figure out these details? Like, is this
not that I know of? I mean, I happened upon this masterclass violinist who was such a great man, and he's the one who he knew Amnon Weinstein and helped me make that connection. And in Amherst, there's a Holocaust historian who I happen to have sent our children went to day school together, and etc. So there were just kind of random local things. And in fact, a builder we know was a tracker, like a human tracker, and he helped me understand how your feet would have to move so that there would be no trace. And if you step on grass and it bends, the light changes. So if someone's really looking for someone, they can tell if someone's been there. Even if it doesn't look disturbed, there will be like a different angle of light and really subtle things. So if you're trying to get away without making a trace, you need to sort of figure out how to move. But these were, random local and some friends and interesting connections. Yeah.
It makes it seem like even more unlikely that anyone would have survived when you know what it takes to hide yourself in that way.
I agree. It's incredible. And the people who did survive, I mean, there was so much ingenuity and creativity and perseverance. It was very amazing.
So you talked a little bit about the kind of musical research that you needed to do in addition to the setting research. So, and music plays such a huge piece in the story. I have two questions related to that. One is to talk a little bit about sort of why you chose to make Shira a musical prodigy and how that works in the book. And maybe your answer to this will speak to the second question, which is there a particular role of music in your life that kind of informed that choice?
Yeah. So first of all, I made a decision to have music be like a connective tissue between Shira and her family. And that's something she could have with her when they're together and also when they're apart. And that felt really important. And I think the idea that someone has to be hidden but feels so much like they hear songs inside them or hear music. I mean, another person might have another experience where they feel like they're going to burst with something, but I wanted that experience where there was like this, it's not easy to stay quiet, but kids have so much inside them wanting to come out creatively, inquisitively and whatever. And I chose music as the thing that she kind of had bursting at the seams there. But I think it was the connective quality that really kind of made a difference for me. And I think that is a very personal thing. My dad played violin every day of my life. He got up and played every day, and he wasn't a virtuoso, but he was someone who used music, I think, to connect to his Jewish roots, to connect to his family, some of whom were lost. And then I trained to be a singer. I actually trained as an opera singer, and my dad and I made music together. And in my memoir about deafness, I do talk about the ways in which I felt unheard myself. So when, we had these deaf children, we were worried about whether they would hear, but I was also worried about whether I would hear them, because I felt that I didn't always have models for hearing in my family, but music was an exception. So when I sang, I felt my mom really stopped and listened, and my father too. And it was just this area of life where I felt connected. And so I really knew about the connective tissue of it. And I also knew kind of the transportive power of music. And so I think those are the things that really moved me to add music to the story.
I loved the way that music operated both as the thing that Shira had to tamp down and silence, but then also as the language that could replace spoken language when she had trouble kind of reemerging into voice.
Yeah, the violin was her voice in many ways. I mean, the yellow bird was her voice, but through, music was the thing the yellow bird could express, and then the violin as well. So that's true. It's like she had to keep it down in the one way, but it was coming out anyway, one way or another, and through the bird and later through her violin.
So maybe let's read a little piece. I mean, you should read a little piece, not together.
Sure.
I think, well, let's start with a piece about the yellow bird, since you mentioned that, and we can talk a little bit about the bird.
Okay, so I'll just read, I'm going to read the very first page, which kind of has something of the story of the bird. The girl is forbidden from making a sound, so the yellow bird sings. He sings whatever the girl composes in her head, high-pitched trills of piccolo, low-throated growls of contrabassoon. The bird chirps all the musical parts save percussion, because the barn rabbits obligingly thump their back feet like bass drums, like snares. The lines for violin and cello are the most elaborately composed, rich and liquid smooth, except when fear turns the notes gruff and choppy. Music helps the flowers bloom. When the daisies grow abundant, The bird weaves a garland for the girl to wear on her head like a princess, though no one can see. She must hide from everyone in the village, soldiers, the farmhouse boys, the neighbors too. The lady with squinty eyes and blocky shoes just dragged a boy down the street and returned smug and straight-backed, cradling a sack of sugar like a baby. When giants tromp past, the bird holes up in a knot in the rafter, silent and still. Tending the garden must wait. The girl, music trapped inside, buries herself under hay. She imagines her mother whispering their nightly story, or whisper singing her favorite lullaby. She holds tight to her blanket and tries to fall asleep, sniffing in vain for the faded scent of home.
Thank you. That was beautiful. So the bird is sort of this magical element in the story. How did you come up with this as an element of the book?
Well, so I wanted her to have a comfort. She had her mother in the barn, which is an incredibly, I don't want to say lucky, because nothing was lucky there, but there were children who didn't have their parents, and that she had her mother meant everything. And she did have this blanket that eventually became like a shred of cloth, as many of her children's blankets do, but I wanted her to have something that could express her in some ways. And I had heard of a child in a trauma who had gone silent and cupped her hands and would kind of place it down when she sat down and things like that. And I thought this is an interesting idea, that she might have an imaginary friend of sorts, and that it could have this role in expressing her, being able to kind of enact some of her childhood, have emotions that she can't express out loud. So if the bird can it can peck and it can chirp and whatever, and it can express things that she isn't able to express. So also my daughter had these 3 imaginary friends when she was growing up, which was somewhat disconcerting sometimes. And I don't know if you're aware of Adam Gopnik's daughter had a imaginary friend she called Mr. Ravioli, and he was never available to play. So it was like this scary New York story where she's like, hey, can we meet? And he's like, too busy, and whatever. Anyway, there was
I remember reading that piece.
It was great. But anyway, I thought it would be something that would add kind of texture and a magical element. And I did want it to feel ambiguous about whether the bird was real or not, because for a child imagining, they seem so real to them. And I wanted it to be like, at times, like maybe a bird did get into the barn. Really? Maybe not. So that you really believed that this girl, had this friend or of sorts. Yeah.
And why did you make the bird yellow?
Well, there were several reasons for that. The color yellow, I think, does have this symbolism with the yellow star that people had to wear on their clothes. But I also think of yellow as like a friendly color, and it was going to be her friend, and I wanted it to be a color that a bird really could be, in case there was that, so there would be the ambiguity. So there were many reasons, and also stars in the sky. And I wanted the bird is a hopeful thing for her, and the bird is a kind of connection between, not just the bird ends up connecting her to her mother too, because her mother starts telling stories about this brave girl and her bird. And so now it's not just her imagination and her bird, but her mother takes up the story. And so now it's something they share. And every night the mother tells an installment of the girl and her bird. So this bird becomes a connection. So I don't know, yellow had kind of many facets to it for me, to speak in its favor as a choice.
I liked the way the bird was also kind of the being on which she could project the things that she was experiencing. That it was going through the same things she was going through.
Yeah. And then, I started having it morph, it became gray and scary, and the talons got sharp. And I was letting it embody, a lot of what was going on for her mentally. And then she would send the bird off to try to find her mother. And, I just wanted it to play a dynamic role. And, also, it was interesting as a writer to have the bird because it added this. So I was in a 5-year-old's point of view when I was writing from Shira's point of view. And sometimes, there's only so much that a 5-year-old is going to be able to articulate. And so the bird kind of allowed me a little bit of, I could add subtext to the book that I might not have been able to without the bird.
Maybe read a little piece from Shira's point of view.
Sure. I'm just going to take a drink of water.
Sure.
Sorry if you all heard that gulp. It's okay.
This is real. We're all real here.
Yeah. Okay. So this is really early on because I don't want to spoil anything, but she's in the barn with her mom. Shira practices being invisible. She hunches her shoulders, sucks in her stomach, slinks like a cat. Her mother practices too, burying herself deep in the hay and beckoning Shira with a wave of her hand to settle into her lap and be still. Or with a finger to her lips, she instructs her to stay silent. The floorboards are rough and the hay is sharp and scratchy. Shira does not understand why they can't go home, why they ever left home, where together her mother and father tucked her into bed as if in a soft, downy nest, and where music and the scent of her grandmother's baking wafted through the air. There, Shira could patter down the hall and join the company, watching as they unclasped the cases of their instruments. Nestled in her grandfather's lap, breathing in his workshop smells of sawdust and lacquer, she bounced and tapped to the ripple of notes from her mama's cello, her tata's violin. At first, in the tuning and warm-up, everything sounded off-kilter and sad. But then they struck up their songs, and the music carried them all until Shira no longer felt herself settled against her grandfather, but in an altogether different place of pure, shared beauty. Vibrant, soulful melodies, fiery, stomping rhythms. It didn't matter how loud things got. There wasn't a neighbor in the building who didn't relish their playing. Shira could even hum if she wanted to. But here, her mother is insistent. They need to be silent, to hide. So she coils herself tight like a spring and holds herself in. Shira strives to mute the sound of every movement, her footfalls, her breath. The anticipated stream of her pee she has learned to mete out in a near silent trickle, and she knows to cover over and so erase any sign of her existence, a series of vanishing moments, before she retreats beneath piles of hay. Yet even as Shira wills herself to silence, her body defies her with a sudden sneeze, an involuntary swallow, the loud crack of her hip from being still too long. A calf muscle cramps, an itch needs a scratch. Her bowels press. The most carefully planned movement causes the hay to rustle or a floorboard to whine. Shira looks over at her mother apologetically. Worried, her mother stares back. Shira settles into the hay and tries again to be still until notes, snippets of song, and soon whole passages take shape and pulse through her, quiet at first, then building in intensity and growing louder. A story told with strings and woodwinds, a glacial night, a flickering fire, sounds like black water beneath bright ice, basses and timpani and a violin's yearnings, and finally a crescendo, the frozen earth cracking. Her mother waves an arm, her forehead furrowed. Shira realizes she is tapping again.
I love the way that you balance the kind of confusion she has about what's going on and trying to make sense of it, and then the clarity of what she hears in the music, so that there's such a sense of where her kind of amazing perception lies.
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation was so incredibly confusing, and especially for children. And I think that for, in my story, it's so difficult for a parent to know how much to clarify for your child. I feel like Rosha wanted her to be proud of her Jewishness. She didn't want to say we're being hunted because we're Jewish. She was making decisions about what to reveal and what not to reveal in order to keep her kind of constitutionally intact and to for all kinds of reasons. And so I think it was really hard for parents to know sort of exactly what to explain. And I mean, later it would be important if that's what she understood about herself to either, she'd have to conceal it. So it might have also been a gamble, like maybe I shouldn't clarify because it's only going to be harder to conceal.
Right. It's another truth she would have to hide. It seems like there would need to be a lot of research. I mean, we already talked about all the research you did on setting and, place and all of that, but it also feels like there's so much research, or there's so much interiority and sort of psychology that goes into this, that there would need to be a lot of research on what the effects are of, having to stay silent or hidden and all of those kinds of things. Was that a piece of the work for you as well?
Yeah, I mean, I did so much reading, a lot of memoir reading, a lot of reading about the psychology of survivorship in every generation, really, because it's so complicated. And, there were versions, like every novelist, there are there's a lot on the cutting room floor, but there were versions of this story that got into some dark psychological places as a result of so much of my reading, where there were things people would struggle with, and there was sort of a decision about sort of which roads ultimately to go down for this version of the novel that became this published book. But yes, there was so much about kind of how people processed, how it affected them. In so many ways. And I think like one way that might come out a little bit is around food and hunger and satiety, satiety. I think I sort of had it in my mind that it was so complicated to be starving, to see your mother trying to give you back food, to how it feels to get food when other people are starving. And, all these kind of dynamics were so much there.
Yeah. And it was all handled very sensitively. I kept thinking as I was reading this, that it's very hard to write a Holocaust book at all, I mean, to begin with. And then it's hard to enter into this field where there's a lot of literature. And that it's also a time when it seems like there are a lot of books about the Holocaust that are coming out. I don't know if that's because we're sort of in this moment where everyone is realizing that we're nearing the end of the time when survivors will be among us and where we'll actually be able to hear stories from living survivors. So what was it like to be writing a book about the Holocaust, both, entering the field of Holocaust literature and writing it particularly at this moment?
I mean, for one thing, I was steeped in this for a really long time, and there's a lot of sadness, and it's just a heartbreaking topic in some ways. So it's hard to, it was something to sustain this project over a long period of time, and stay very, very attentive to the realities of the Holocaust. I think that, I have some, family history, and, whenever we go to Holocaust memorials, there's so many Rosners, and like so many other names, but we see them and we know this. And I don't know, I think that, writing your heritage is like with all the psychological material that you draw on as a writer, it was just really part of my core. And so it was there. As a person writing a novel, I think it's hard to be in a field like this, a crowded field, first of all, and one where it is sad and people sometimes have to kind of turn away from it. Like you hear people say, I just can't read another Holocaust novel. And feeling like, for my novel, it is obviously set in the Holocaust, but it's really about a mother-daughter connection, and it's about the place of creativity and beauty and human survival. And it's about like other things, and I mean, maybe that's true of many of the stories, but I feel that, I was really interested in the nature of hiding and silence, and that really didn't have to be a Holocaust setting. I chose it to be ultimately, and I think it kind of fit with also my decision for the music to play a role and all these kind of things that happened in the structure of the novel. But I don't know, I think it's complicated to be the novelist of a Holocaust story. I mean, at any time, but especially now, like you said. But on the other hand, I think you're also right about how we want these stories to be out there. We want people thinking, especially young people, who this is a distant war. And, you want to have this out there for them. You want to keep the story alive. You want to keep this in mind, and God forbid it, keep it from ever happening again, and all these things. So it seems really also important.
Yeah, I was struck by, I think it was the New York Times review of your book, which was a rave review, but it started with a line that was something like, if you had any doubt about whether we really need another novel about the Holocaust, then this book shows that there's still new things to say. Or so it was something that was a wonderful start, but I thought, oh God, that's the place you're starting from, is like readers are wondering, like, why is there another book about this?
Yeah. Yeah.
But of course there's also, I mean, as you said, you started with a particular theme of a hidden child. And then also the theme of the separation of parents and children also feels really, really relevant in this moment.
Yeah. And one thing I want to say about that is that, I was writing this while, as, we're seeing this stuff happen at our borders. And when I was interviewing the hidden children, there was so much pain for those who had been separated from their parents. And even though they were separated in order to survive, they know their parents, kind of put them in a different setting in order that they would live. There was this kind of pain and hurt that even, it was 75 years later, I was talking to them, and it was acute. And I just realized that those children at the border, who are 4 and 5 or whatever, 75 years later, this is not going away. What we're doing is so, so hard. And it's just the pain is going to stay on forever. And it really struck me that it, despite what beautiful, full lives the people I spoke to have built, there was just this immense pain. And longing. And I imagined that from the parent's side, having to make a decision like that there's sort of this well of guilt or shame, despite knowing that the decision, again, was so that your child would live, but to make those decisions to separate from your child. And, there's no way around those residual feelings that may never recede. And I wanted to capture those things, like in my decision to have Rosha give Shira up to the convent and then arrive at a family camp and see that there were families with children. And she starts saying, I could have maybe brought Shira with me, and start questioning and doubting, what she did. And then find that in one scene, a child does die. There was nothing that was safe anyway, but it felt, I think, at every turn that maybe there was a better decision I could have made or something. I don't think no one was at peace.
Right. Someone asked a question at the beginning, I think it was Sheila, about the ending and whether you intended it to be ambiguous. I know you don't want to spoil it for folks who haven't read it yet, but I don't know if you want to comment.
I can try to comment. Yeah. What I'll say is that the ending, am I spoiling?
I think it's okay. I think it's okay to spoil it. It seems like a lot of people have read it. We're getting a lot of comments from folks who loved it. And
okay. So, what I think is really interesting about the ending and sort of the varied reactions is, it's a bit of a projection screen for the reader. And I have a theory about good writing, which is that, that the writer meets the reader in the middle. And so the writer does this work and the reader does this work. And if the writer does too much work, it's kind of boring for the reader. And if the writer doesn't do enough work, the reader is struggling and saying, what's happening in this book? I don't understand. So I think it's like right here. And by putting it out there that, she always does scan in the audience hoping. And then there's this yellow bird on her shoulder, and there's a woman who stands up, who feels, this, they're right there, right? And now it's up to you. These reunions in real life are very, very complicated. I had a story of about a young girl with her mother, and then they were meeting 20 years later. So the complexity of their real, true reunion would be like another book altogether. and one that I didn't feel was fair to like tape on or patch on to this one, and that would have undermined it, or what would be the past of that, would be undermining to the dearness of their relationship, the sort of simple dearness of a young relationship, contrasted with the real true complexity of having been separated and then coming back together. So it was a choice because I felt like I didn't want to do a disservice to the people who have struggled in these reunions. And I was just recently talking to a historian in Israel about these scenarios that are so incredibly complicated. And it seemed really unfair to make either an Oprah Winfrey, runway ending like that, where you don't really grapple with the true thing. Like, I feel like I had been admitting for complexity in a real way, and I didn't want to have a scenario where I didn't admit for complexity. And so this was a choice. And when I think, we'll probably talk about what else I'm working on, there's going to be a return to that. So we'll get to it.
How do you see this book in relationship to your other books? I mean, so you've written a memoir and a children's book, and now this novel.
Yeah. Well, and before that, I edited this anthology called The Messy Self, which probably sums the whole thing up. That was back from my philosophy days. But I think that I am constantly working on the mother-daughter connectivity. Like that seems to be a theme that's always in my work. I think it comes from what I mentioned earlier, feeling that there was sort of a deafness in my family of origin, and then having our deaf children and wanting to be sure that I would be hearing them. And there's this anecdote from that, the research for my ancestors. I found these two great aunts who were deaf in a little shtetl, and when they, at nighttime, they tied a string from their wrist to their babies so that if the baby fussed, they would feel a tug and wake to care for them, which was like this introduction of an innovation of hearing, an innovation of connection, which meant so much to me. And the memoir, which I have right here, is If a Tree Falls. It's like a story about, so it's like a woven story of the sort of raising our deaf daughters, but also understanding my relationship with my mother, and then understanding also this thing in our family that to be very proud of, these deaf women who really could hear their children. And I think the children's book is actually sort of about that string. And then this novel is really also about a connection, like there's actually, at one point the mother says, when they're going to be split, she says, there's like imaginary chain between us, and the daughter gets upset and says it would break, how would we have it, what, I'm gonna trip on it, fall, or whatever. But like the way in which mothers and daughters, or mothers and children's, I don't know, in my own situation, that's been a bit of, that's sort of the psychological material I work with, I think.
Mm-hmm. And did it feel very different to embark on a novel?
Yeah, it did. So, and also, so I'm a trained philosopher, and each of my creative writing projects has been sort of its own learning curve on my own. Learning how to structure a book. A memoir is one thing, and then a novel is a totally different thing. And I kind of joke that now I should pick like biography, or like what genre, haven't I challenged myself to figure out how to do. Although I've chosen another novel, so that's good. I'm going to kind of try to build on all I've learned, but it was very different. It's also really, I love it. I really loved it because while it's definitely mining your own subconscious and your own psychological material in various ways, it's also kind of distant enough, and there's, still all this room for the creativity. And I think once you write, about your family, you might think, okay, I've done that, I better not do that again. So it's good. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what your new novel is about. I mean, the one you're working on currently.
Yeah. So I have decided that I'm going to be now post World War II. And, but what I'm working on is like a sibling pair, a brother and sister, who have been hidden in a Polish home. And then these organizations that were trying to reclaim Jewish children since so many had been lost. So they take children, from this Polish home, and in one case could be a very loving home, a home they've acclimated to after their first huge rupture in their life. But now, because we've lost so many, they're going to take them and put them into a Jewish setting, which sometimes was an orphanage, sometimes was a children's home, a DP camp, whatever, and eventually maybe get to Palestine. But I wanted to explore that psychology, and the difficulty and the complexity of that. And I have this boy and girl, and they end up at a kibbutz in Israel. And at the kibbutz is a musical prodigy who's playing violin, and the boy and this girl, who we know very well now, meet. And what I like about this thing I'm working on now is that we get to see, not directly from Shira's point of view, but from her husband's point of view, that there will be a reunion with her mother and all the complexity of it, and how complex it is as it bounces off the fact that he lost his mother and then he lost his Polish mother. And if she's having a complex relationship with her living mother, at least she has this living mother, etc. And so just trying to explore all the complexities of it, but from sort of a different vantage point.
Wow. So very much staying with the same story in some way, but continuing it from a different angle.
Yeah. And I just was so, I don't know, I was just really interested in what was called Koordinacja, which was this group that was basically, it was for the redemption of Jewish children, and then Bricha, which was transporting, smuggling people to Israel, to mandated Palestine. But just that, from that place of where we're saving Jews, but then on the individual level, the incredible ambiguity about that, and wanting to know, because in the wake of all kinds of genocides, the things what can we be doing, what is it okay sort of, to do in the wake of a genocide.
Right. We had a question earlier about your relationship to Poland, and you talked a little bit about visiting, but what is it, how do you think about that Poland place now? Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, let me just say, I think that, the choice of Poland, there were so many Jews in Poland, and there were so few Jews by the end. There was so much anti-Semitism in Poland. There were also righteous and heroes in Poland. There was everything was in, Poland was a place that, I guess, whatever material I wanted to draw on was taking place in Poland. Mm-hmm. It was also taking place in other places, but it was definitely there. And my grandmother came from Poland, and we have a family from Poland. But, Poland's really complicated even now, because there's all this kind of stuff about what you can and can't say about World War II. Right. And, and that was kind of brewing up even when I got there with my daughter, when, in our guide, we were talking about this. And I was very worried also about the reception of my novel in Poland, which has been really great, thankfully. But I think that it is really complicated place. Well, I don't know. It's starting to feel like every place is really complicated, our place included. Yeah.
Sure.
So,
how long did it take you to write the book?
Well, it's really hard to know, but I met that hidden child while I was giving a book talk for my memoir, which is in 2010, and it's 2020. It's out here now in the world. So it's been kicking around in my life a really long time. I teach philosophy, and I have kids, and I went traveling and blah, 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 all kinds of things. So I don't know how long it really took me, but let me just say I've been living with it for 10 years. So
it seems par for the course, I would say, for writing a serious book that takes a lot of research.
Yeah. It's a long haul.
How does teaching philosophy fit in with your writing? And, do you feel like your philosophical training shapes the writing that you do as well?
I think that it does, in that I think kind of theoretically or conceptually about certain things. So if I was thinking about the nature of hiding and the nature of of things like that. And it definitely, with respect to this new project, I'm kind of thinking a lot about the morality of the redemption or reclamation or whatever there's like different people call it different things. Like, are you rescuing or were they already rescued by the people who took them in, etc. So I'm constantly, I think the philosophy plays a role, but I think when I sit down and write, something else happens. Actually, I think the singer in me is more prevalent when I'm writing, because I think that I'm very focused on language and lyricism. And so I think in a way that's even more prominent when I write. And the only other thing I'll say is, I think having had deaf children really shapes me as a writer, because my sensory acuity is higher. Like, I think we spent so much time like making sure we were kind of pay attention and listen to every sound so that we could like draw attention so they'd become good listeners, that we became like very astute, like listeners, watchers, feelers, especially because like my children would, when they didn't have their technology, and they would like hold a balloon when music, or feel on the floor the vibrations. And so it sort of set me up in some way. I think that maybe I never would have been, but much more kind of conscious of it. And like when they are in the barn and you're paying attention to like the hay at the middle distance and the texture of it and every sound, and it played a big role. So,
yeah, and the descriptions are beautiful. I mean, it's very clear that you have such sensitivity around detail like that. Goldie asks what it is like to have your characters and your story out there in the world after working on this for years.
I think it's really interesting. Someone said to me, the story will be yours, but the book isn't. And I don't know. It is really true, especially because of the ways people react to different details and the ending and various things that seem to be like kind of, it's their response. I mean, you put things in the world, and then they will make of it whatever they will. And, sometimes it's so gratifying, and it's like, really nice to be in relation to other people, because, you sit alone in your room and write and then to be able to share it in the world is such a gift, and it touches people, and it really is meaningful. And then sometimes when, you disappoint people or they feel frustrated by something, it's just hard. I mean, you're supposed to just not really read the reviews or, because you create your thing. And like everyone, one thing about the ending of my novel is like, it's like a potter, you're pulling the vase up, and then, it's going around the wheel. If you keep touching it, it's just going to fold in. And there's a point where you just have to say, this is a piece of art you're making, and it's just going to be this form, and then hope that and now work on the next thing, and just keep going and trying to, create things. So you have to be a little bit, you have to be philosophical about it.
That sounds very healthy. Carol points out that we haven't touched on Roja's relationship with the farmer.
Okay, I have to scratch my nose. I'm sorry, but we have bunnies in my study because it's so hot outside. No, I'm not usually allergic to them, but their fur is everywhere. Roja and the farmer. Yeah, I mean, this story is a story that is real. It came from someone telling me that their mom was visited by the person who was keeping them, harboring them. And I'm just aware of scenarios like this all through the war. But I really wanted this relationship to be a round and ambiguous, like as round as possible. I mean, Henrik, he rapes her. He also brings potatoes and socks, and he helps do cupping when her daughter's sick. He tells her what plants won't be poisonous in the deep woods. He's probably in love with her. But obviously there's also these power dynamics. She's maybe ambivalent too. I mean, she, initially obviously it wasn't, but then I don't know, I wanted it to be complicated and complex, and I wanted it to be, what it really is, which is, the bodies respond even when you don't want something to happen, and all kinds of things like that. so like I feel like every character in my novel has some complexity to them, and that like or even maybe in retrospect, like the nun seems really mean, but later you see how scared she was, or one of the girls is really mean, but her parents might still be alive in the town, but they gave her to the orphanage. And I mean, it's just how people are, you know, complicated, very imperfect, you know, and I wanted that to be there.
I thought it was also such an important way to explore what women's experience was like, and the embodied nature. I mean, when we think about the Holocaust, we think a lot about, you know, starvation and other kinds of bodily experiences. But I think remembering that also women's bodies were there, and that, first of all, many experienced sexual assault, but also they got their period while they were hiding in barns, and they had pregnancies and miscarriages, and, you know, all kinds of things were happening that don't necessarily make it into the usual narrative, but to bring sort of women's bodily experiences into the story, I think is really important. Also, it's a really important piece of it.
I mean, even like that you have to pee in a barn and poop in a barn, and that you have to try to get your teeth clean, and it like all the kind of things that you try to do, you know, it's so challenging. And you know, one of the things my editor said was like, I don't think I've ever heard, how does someone do this? You know, how can they do it? And especially how do they, you know, she was saying, you know, I can't keep my kids silent for, you know, 20 minutes, never mind, or a snow day is, you know, like this big challenge or whatever. And so the quiet thing is one thing, but all the bodily needs are another. And, you know, and people were resilient and creative and, you know, managed.
Absolutely. We had a question earlier about what authors have been important influences for you as a reader and writer.
Okay. Like, I mean, for one thing, Anthony Doerr has been very important to me. He wrote All the Light We Cannot See. And besides just loving that book, I mean, it was the sentence level beauty of his novel that I just kept returning to over and over. I mean, I just love his writing. And it was sort of a brilliant structure, and there were so many things that were amazing. He played a large role in inspiring me. There are so many different writers who bring so many different things. So I was reading Gilead and Lila by Marilyn Robinson, and just kind of amazed by the ordinariness that's so extraordinary, the way she makes the ordinary extraordinary, in the sort of, and simple things, but they get elevated. It was really an amazing thing to be studying. And Toni Morrison also is just unbelievable. And looking at the ways in which she uses narrators, the way she uses magical realism. I mean, just different things like that. I like Borges. I don't know. There's so many. It's so hard. I always feel stuck because there's just been so many influences, or inspirations, I should say, and at different times. You know, for whatever reason, when I was working on my memoir, I kept rereading Everything is Illuminated by Jonathan Safran Foer. There was something, and also his ex-wife's book, The History of Love, Nicole Cross. There was something about the longing and the keep returning to the longing that, you know, at different times, I think novelists kind of turn to different work because it's speaking to them at that moment. And in fact, just tonight I was saying how I want to reread Beloved because I think there's an omniscient narrator in it, and my daughter goes, "Oh my God, you're such a writer!" You know? So I do read as a writer a lot, and sometimes that's great, and sometimes I just read to just soak up a story, and like, you know, and that's also very, very pleasant. And the book I just recently, today I went to my local bookstore, you know, risked my life and bought, I bought the book called Hamnet, which I think it's Maggie O'Farrell, but I hope that's correct. It's a story about William Shakespeare's son who died, and and just a few years later, Hamlet is the story, is the play he wrote. But Hamnet, his son's name was Hamnet, and that's interchangeable at the time, weirdly. And anyway, there's just this, I heard on NPR, I heard, an interview, and she read a snippet, and I was like, I gotta read that book. There was something about, like this mother checking through her children and then stumbling and like getting stuck on Hamnet because he had died, and she just couldn't, she kept like, and Hamnet, and it was just so moving. And yeah, so
right,
there's a lot of influences.
I think it's always like the little scenes or words that can just kind of grab you and bring you in.
Yeah.
What has your reading and writing life during COVID been like?
The first 2 months were terrible. I just really couldn't do either thing. I couldn't read or write. And it was really hard because there were, you go on Facebook and everyone's like, I wrote my 20,000 words for the day. And I was like, wow, if I could write one sentence, I'd be proud of myself. Very hard to focus. I felt really, it was heartbreaking times reading in New York and whatever, Italy, all the things that were happening in our world. And it's not that it's so great right now, but I guess, over time I started to either I've kind of, I created barriers or I sort of broke through. So actually Lily King's novel, Writers and Lovers, was the first book I was able to absorb. And I was so grateful. I'm going to always love that book because it was the thing that got me past my stuck place reading.
I loved that book too.
It was awesome. And I don't know how it was amazing. And from then I started to be able to read again after that, and I kind of started swallowing up books again, and I think that I got some traction in my head about this new novel, and then I could finally write. But I had been kind of touching a very slippery surface for a long time, like nothing was sticking. I couldn't get anywhere. But I think somehow I switched to this project and I got really inspired, and now I'm working. So I feel like I'm writing and reading now, and COVID is still raging, but at the beginning it was just so hard and very distracting, and all I could do was read the news. So
when, if we can ask this, I don't know if you know the answer, but when do you think we can expect your new book? When should we be looking for it?
Well, I really hope it won't be a 10-year slog like the last one. It's going much faster, which maybe it's because of the learning curve, having written a novel, or maybe I'm still in it. I'm steeped in this particular time, and this character. I've done so much research already in a way. So I don't know. I don't have a title yet. It's funny because my manuscript that's now The Yellowbird Sings had the title Hidden on it forever. It was called Hidden. That was the working title, which I don't know. I was like, Hidden. And my editor was like, you can't call your book Hidden. And I'm like, oh, I thought maybe we could, but apparently we couldn't. And so this one, I don't know. I feel somewhat embarrassed to give it a working title because whatever it's going to be, apparently it won't be that. And, titles, covers, there are certain things authors don't have all that much, like my editor was so collaborative. I did have plenty to say, but it's the kind of thing typically that you don't get to control. You get to control what's inside the book, and they control what's on the outside of the book. So I don't know. I'm hoping, maybe I'm being overly optimistic. I hope 2 to 3 years.
Well, we're in to wait for it. So don't worry about that.
Thank you.
Just do your writing.
Okay.
It's a hard world. I'm very impressed with anyone who's writing anything now. I am not, and I'm usually someone who does write a lot. So I'm glad for you that you're able to write, and we will look forward to reading it whenever it comes out.
Thank you. You're very sweet.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us tonight and for sharing your book with us. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. This was a great conversation. And I hope you will all, if you haven't already read The Yellowbird Sings, I hope you will go out and buy it. Tonight
at your local bookstore.
Yes, and we actually just put the link to the book to bookshop.org, which is another way to do it in a way that benefits independent bookstores. But yes, we want our local bookstores to stay in business. Tonight is the last night of the Quarantine-ish book talks until September, so you don't have too long to wait. And we will return in September with a new lineup of great conversations. But do not worry. In the meantime, JWA is offering a history course, a new history course called Jewish Women You Thought You Knew or Never Knew. And it's going to be wonderful. We are really excited about it. I hope you will register and join us each Thursday night in August at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or actually Eastern Time, for a conversation with a scholar about Jewish women who shaped our story. And for those of you who are new to JWA, I hope you will check out the many, many resources we have in our digital archive at jwa.org, from online exhibits to lesson plans to primary sources to a podcast, a multi-generational blog. There is so much to discover and to help you gain insights about history and role models and give us insight into understanding the world that we live in today. And I hope to see many of you next week for the first session of our history course, and of course back in September for more of the Quarantine-ish book club. Until next time, thank you so much. Have a wonderful night. Be well, everybody. Stay healthy.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Jennifer. Wonderful. Thank you. That was fabulous.
Thank you. Are we still on?
We're still on. People take a little while to come off. They love to see if we're chatting, but lots of good comments, and people really enjoyed it. So
thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It was great.